Hello and welcome back to Bedtime Stories with Nonna Angie at the Davenport Public Library. We are currently reading a chapter a day of The Miraculous Journey of Edward Tulane by Kate DeCamillo. It's illustrated by Bagram Iba Tulane and it's published by Candlewick Press, who has granted us permissions to read this together. So I have to warn you that tonight is kind of a sad part of the story. Do you remember that Edward was a scarecrow and then Bryce was working in the fields and he cut Edward down and he took him home to his sister, Sarah Ruth, who's been very, very ill. And that's kind of where we left him. Here's a picture of Edward and what's going on with him there. So chapter 19. The days passed and the sun rose and set and rose and set again and again. Sometimes the father came home and sometimes he did not. Edward's ears became soggy and he did not care. His sweater was almost completely unraveled and it did not bother him. He was hugged half to death and it felt good. In the evenings, at the hands of Bryce, at the ends of the twine, Edward danced and danced. Remember, Bryce tied twine to Edward's arms and legs so that he could make him dance like a puppet for Sarah Ruth, and she just loved that. 1 month passed, and then 2, and then 3. Sarah Ruth got worse. In the 5th month, she refused to eat. And in the 6th month, she began to cough up blood. Her breathing became ragged and uncertain, as if she was trying to remember in between breaths what to do. What breathing was. Breathe, honey, Bryce stood over her and said. Breathe, thought Edward from deep inside the well of her arms. Please, please breathe. Bryce stopped leaving the house. He sat at home all day and held Sarah Ruth in his lap and rocked her back and forth and sang to her. On a bright morning in September, Sarah Ruth stopped breathing. Oh, no, said Bryce. Oh, honey, take a little breath, please. Edward had fallen out of Sarah Ruth's arms the night before, and she had not asked for him again. So face down on the floor, arms over his head, Edward listened as Bryce wept. He listened as his father came home and shouted at Bryce. He listened as the father wept. You can't cry, Bryce shouted. You've got no right to cry. You never even loved her. You don't know nothing about love. I loved her, said the father. I loved her. I loved her too, thought Edward. I loved her and now she's gone. How could this be, he wondered. How could he bear to live in a world without Sarah Ruth? The yelling between the father and the son continued, and then there was a terrible moment when the father insisted that Sarah Ruth belonged to him, that she was his girl, his baby, and that he was taking her to be buried. She ain't yours, Bryce screamed. You can't take her. She ain't yours. But the father was bigger and stronger, and he prevailed. He wrapped Sarah Ruth in a blanket, and he carried her away. The small house became very quiet. Edward could hear Bryce moving around, muttering to himself, and then finally, the boy picked Edward up. Come on, Jangles, Bryce said. We're leaving. We're going to Memphis. Oh my gosh. Okay, there's Bryce and Edward. They're heading to Memphis. I told you it was going to be so sad tonight. Chapter 23. That's what Edward looks like when he's on his strings, when he's getting ready to dance. How many dancing rabbits have you seen in your life? Bryce said to Edward. I can tell you how many I've seen. 1. You. That's how you and me are going to make some money. I seen it last time I was in Memphis. Folks put on any kind of a show right there on the street corner, and people pay 'em for it. I seen it. The walk to town took all night. Bryce walked without stopping, carrying Edward under one arm and talking to him the whole time. Edward tried to listen, but the terrible scarecrow feeling had come back. The feeling he had when he was hanging by his ears in the old lady's garden, and feeling that nothing mattered and that nothing would ever matter again. And not only did Edward feel hollow, he ached. Every part of his china body hurt. ached for Sarah Ruth. He wanted to hold her. He wanted to dance for her. And he did dance, but it was not for Sarah Ruth. Edward danced for strangers on a dirty street corner in Memphis. Bryce played his harmonica and moved Edward's strings, and Edward bowed and shuffled and swayed, and people stopped to stare and point and laugh. On the ground in front of them was Sarah Ruth's button box. The lid was open to encourage people to drop change inside it. "Mama," said a small child, "look at that bunny. I want to touch him." He reached out his hand for Edward. "No," said the mother, "dirty." And she pulled the child back away from Edward. "Nasty," she said. A man wearing a hat stopped and stared at Edward and Bryce. "It's a sin to dance," he said. And then after a long pause, he said, "It's a particular sin for rabbits to dance." The man took off his hat and held it over his heart. He stood and watched the boy and the rabbit for a long time. Finally, he put his hat back on his head and he walked away. The shadows lengthened. The sun became an orange, dusty ball low in the sky. Bryce started to cry. Edward saw his tears land on the pavement, but the boy did not stop playing his harmonica. He did not make Edward stop dancing. An old woman leaning on a cane stepped up close to them. She stared at Edward with deep, dark eyes. "Pellegrina?" thought the dancing rabbit. She nodded at him. "Look at me," he said to her, his arms and his legs jerked. "Look at me. You got your wish. I have learned how to love, and it's a terrible thing. I'm broken. My heart is broken. Help me." The old woman turned and hobbled away. "Come back," thought Edward. "Fix me." Bryce cried harder. He made Edward dance faster, and finally, when the sun was gone and the streets were dark, Bryce stopped playing his harmonica. "I'm done now," he said. He let Edward fall to the pavement. "I ain't gonna cry anymore." Bryce wiped his nose and his eyes with the back of his hand. He picked up the button box and he looked inside it. "We got us enough money to get something to eat," he said. "Come on, Jangles." Oh my gosh, I think we're gonna stop there. And I know I hate stopping on such a sad part. But life is like that, isn't it? Sometimes you're really, really happy, and sometimes bad things happen, and then you're very sad. It's just the ups and the downs, and you have to learn how to live through all the parts of it. So hopefully when we come back next time and we find Edward, they'll have gotten something to eat and things will start to look up for them again. So thanks for stopping by tonight, and we will see you next week.